We good, Stephanie? Oh, we're recording. Excellent. Outstanding. Perfect. We need to talk about a man who was angry at God. More specifically, we need to talk about a man who was angry with what he thought God was doing and also what he thought God was not doing. And that is actually a really common thing. I don't know that we want to talk about it very often. I think a lot of times we want to kind of suppress. One question I get from a lot of people is, is it okay to have questions? Is it okay to doubt? Is it okay, to be upset, to be angry? And, people have feelings, right? Like people have emotions. And if you're a human person, you're going to inevitably ask questions that maybe you don't have great answers to, or inevitably you're going to have some doubts. Inevitably, you're going to get frustrated, and sometimes you may even get angry. So talking about a man who's angry is not really the most novel thing, really. But talking about a prophet of God who is angry with God sort of is. Talking about somebody who speaks on behalf of God to other people who is very angry with God, well, that's an interesting conversation. And it's a conversation about a man by the name of Habakkuk. So there's a guy named Habakkuk in the Bible, and he's a prophet. And he lives about 600 years before Jesus, which may not mean a lot to you, but hopefully to get a perspective on what's going on, some of this will, okay? So I think sometimes when we talk about the Old Testament, we just think like, oh, it's just all then. Like we just dump it all in the Old Testament box, and we just, shove characters together like, people hung out with each other. And we fail to realize that we're talking about real people, and we're talking about vast periods of time. So Habakkuk is a prophet to the people of Israel about 600 years before Jesus is born, which is another way of saying about 800 years after the Exodus, which is another way of saying that Habakkuk was as far from the Exodus being God freeing his people from slavery, giving them their own nation, and them becoming, the people of God. He is as far away from that event as we are from the 1200s. Like Genghis Khan was conquering China as recently to us as Moses was leading the people of Israel distance-wise from Habakkuk. 800 years, that's a long, long time. A little bit more perspective. We think about the greatest kings of Israel, and you're probably going to think about like David, like David and Goliath, and then there's Solomon. We got a lot of Solomon stuff, with the temple and everything else. David and Solomon are roughly 400 years before Habakkuk, which is another way of saying Habakkuk and his ministry is as far from the glory days of Israel with their kings as we are from the Mayflower landing at Plymouth Rock. We sometimes think it's just all shoved together, like David and Moses are buddies, right? Or like, Daniel and Solomon or whatever, That's not the case. And all of that is to say, the people that Habakkuk ministered to, that he preached to, that he prophesied to, it had been a really long time since God, in their view, had shown up in a dramatic way. For them, we think about the Exodus and David and Goliath and that kind of stuff. That's just so far back there, right? But to them, it was also so far back there. I mean, we're talking hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And so it's easy to imagine how sort of they maybe forgot, or maybe they don't quite feel those emotions. I mean, like we sometimes can. It's hard for us to imagine how we felt in February, right? and these people, we're talking 800 years between the Exodus and Habakkuk. So the people, it's not like these people were, gung ho about, the ways of God or the promises of God. Anyway, but then about 100 years before Habakkuk does his ministry, the Assyrians, this massive empire, comes and conquers most of Israel. And so it was a tragic time. It was a dark time. It was a time when, there's not a lot of freedom. Things aren't going well. And a lot of times I think we think, oh, well, they would depend on like the Lord's promises. Well, those promises were really, truly old, just so old, that it's a lot like asking us to, rely on those same promises. So all of that adds up to a period of time in Israel's history where things weren't going well. It was a dark time. It was a difficult time. There was violence. There was corruption. And Habakkuk was tasked with sharing the truth of God with these people who were corrupt and violent and didn't have faith and were far distanced from all the stories that we understand in the Bible. And it didn't go well. Nobody listened. Habakkuk prayed. Nothing happened. Habakkuk prophesied. Nothing got better. Habakkuk preached. Nobody listened. And after a while of that, Habakkuk got mad. And he didn't get mad at the people. He got mad at God. He got extremely angry with God. And the Bible records what he was angry about. And it tells us that it was something like this. Habakkuk goes to God and he says, God, listen, all I see everywhere is violence. All I see everywhere is corruption. All I see everywhere is wicked people prospering while good poor people suffer. That the poor are mistreated. That the vulnerable are they're mistreated. Over and over and over, bad things happen because Habakkuk tells God there are more bad people in Israel now. There are more wicked people in Israel than there are good people. And that's just the way it is. And Habakkuk goes to God and he says, I've told you this. I have prayed. I have asked you to do something. I have told you the situation. I've come before you. And he tells God, look, God, you don't seem to care. You seem to just like be watching and just, you're not doing anything. Like we need intervention. There is there's no one intervening. We need somebody to help. There's no help. We need somebody to change the hearts and minds of the people. Nothing's happening. Habakkuk goes to God and says, I keep praying and I get no answer. I keep preaching and no one cares. And he blames God and he says, why are you not doing your job? You're supposed to be our Savior. You're supposed to be the one that leads us. You're supposed to be the one that guides us. I keep hearing about all these hundreds of old things, but nothing, like we don't have anything now. And he tells God, I'm not going to stop. I demand an answer from you. And so that's what Habakkuk does. And because Habakkuk is a prophet, God answers him. Which is kind of neat when you think about it. God just gives him an answer. He says, okay, Habakkuk, all of that's fair. Not going to get any argument from me. All that's fair. I understand how you feel. He says, I'm going to tell you what I'm doing, you're not going to understand. You're not going to like it. If I told you, you're going to argue with me. But since you asked, I'll tell you anyway. But just understand, you're not going to like it. He said, okay, I've seen the wickedness of Israel. I've seen what you're talking about. I know what you're talking about. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to send you the Babylonians, and they're going to judge Israel. So that's an answer, and that's neat. And God, to be fair, had warned Habakkuk, you're not going to like this. You're not going to believe it. It's not an answer you're going to appreciate. And yeah, that's not an answer Habakkuk would appreciate, and we should be able to understand why when I just tell you this. So the Assyrian Empire was the biggest empire in the world at the time, okay? They just conquered everybody. They just, whatever they saw, they were like, oh, that's mine, and that's just what they did. Well, anytime any empire, or any large nation really, starts acting like that, it's on shaky ground. Violence always begets more violence. A power structure, a power feud always begets more power structures and feud. The more power there is, the more people want it, and it just never works out. And so the Assyrian Empire had this city, this people group essentially called the Babylonians, Babylon. It turns out Babylon was they were sort of like the toughest soldiers and people within the Assyrian Empire. They were really tough. And one day the Babylonians realized, well, we're doing all this fighting. We're sort of the tip of the spear, so to speak, of the Assyrian Empire. Everyone's afraid of us, not the Assyrians. We should be running everything. And it begins a civil war. And as it turns out, the Babylonians were right. They won the civil war, and they became the empire. They became the people in charge. They became the people who could rule everything with power and everything else. And that was bad news for the rest of the world. Because the Assyrians had been cruel and vicious and bloodthirsty. They were willing to do things no one else was willing to do. And they lost a war to Babylon. What does that tell you about the Babylonians? Like, the Babylonians were worse than the Assyrians, who were the bloodthirsty, vicious, cruel people that would do things that nobody else would do. And the Babylonians were worse than them. So Habakkuk, who no doubt knows exactly who the Babylonians are, and has no doubt prayed to God that they never show up to Israel's, borders, has now been told by God the solution to the wickedness of Israel is to punish them, to judge them, using the Babylonians. And God had warned, you're not going to like my answer. And Habakkuk, boy, did he not like that answer. And he wasn't any less angry. He wasn't any less frustrated. He wasn't any less upset. He was more angry and more frustrated and more upset. And if you read the text in Habakkuk chapter 2, in his second complaint, it's anger, but now it's like almost desperation and like depression. Like, Habakkuk realized that God isn't kidding. And now he's not just angry, but he's devastated by this news. And so he complains to God again. And he says, listen, God, I got two complaints, two main points to my complaint here. Okay? The first complaint is, I asked you to do something about the wicked people of Israel. If you send the Babylonians, that'll do. But also all the people, the wicked people in Israel were hurting, they're going to get hurt too. It's not like the Babylonians are going to show up, give a morality test, and then slaughter them. That's not how that's going to work. It's not like they're going to show up and say, hey, we're going to take you into exile, but only for the bad people. That's not how the Babylonians work. So Habakkuk says, well, what? That doesn't actually fix the problem. Like, that's sort of like, shooting a cockroach with a shotgun. Okay, the cockroach is gone, now you got this giant hole in your floor. That's not going to work. And he sort of gives us this interesting illustration. He says, God, do you just see us like fish? Like, do you just see us as like fish to be caught? Like, we mean so little to you that you're just getting us in mass numbers and you just don't even care at all? Like when you catch giant fishing nets, you're not really discriminating between, who is good and who is bad and any of that. Do you just not care at all if we're faithful or righteous or caring or anything? Like, do you care? What are we even to you? That was his first part. And the second part, he said, listen, the Babylonians are terrible. The Babylonians are the worst of the worst. They are the bloodthirsty of the bloodthirstiest of the bloodthirsty. They're the most violent. They are the most cruel. And you said you're going to send the Babylonians? Like, you're in league with the worst people ever? How is that not evil, God? Habakkuk asks the question, how is that not evil? How are you not evil for partnering with these people? And Habakkuk, this is not going to work at all. And so God gives him another response. And it's a long response. It's lengthy. But the core of that response comes in a passage that we need to read. It's in Habakkuk chapter 2. And this is God responding to Habakkuk after his two complaints about how everybody is terrible and nobody is listening and nothing's going right and God is not doing anything. This is what he says. God says, has not the Lord of heaven's armies promised that the wealth of nations will turn to ashes? They work so hard, but it's all in vain. For as the waters fill the sea, the earth will be filled with an awareness of the glory of the Lord. There's two things in that passage. One of them sounds sort of nice, but is sort of beside the point, it seems like. The second one seems absolutely not good at all. But Habakkuk heard this and immediately understood. And so we should also. So let's just rewind a little bit just to make sure we're here. Habakkuk's initial complaint is, there's all these bad people doing bad things. No one has faith. No one cares. Everyone is corrupt. Everyone is violent. It's all awful. Goes to God. He says, you're not doing anything about it. God says, cool, fine. All right, well, I'll do something. I'll send worse people to take care of them. And Habakkuk says, yeah, I didn't mean that. That's not what I meant. Because now we just have worse people. So now I have a second complaint. We have the worst people showing up. And somehow this is good news. Habakkuk heard this as good news. And here's why. We have to put ourselves in the shoes of an ancient Israelite person, or really just most ancient people, and recognize that to them, the pursuit of wealth always went hand in hand with pain. Not always for the person pursuing the wealth, but, for the people that got in their way or were bystanders as they did it. Things like slavery were something. Like, I think sometimes we imagine in our heads that white people came up with slavery. Like, slavery has always existed as long as people have existed. Taking people and just saying, hey, I own you now, and I'm going to use you as a piece of property to make me money, that's a terrible thing people have always done. It's always been awful. It's always been awful. It was awful when we did it. It was awful, for tens of thousands of years before that. But it's always been there in the pursuit of wealth. I'm trying to make money, so now I hurt you. That's one out of 10 billion examples. When wealthy people make money, there's always a back end to that. Okay? There's always somebody making pennies, children, making, pennies a day doing the labor in some far off country, right? There's always somebody being hurt. Wealthy people exploiting poor people. Powerful people exploiting people who have nothing. That's the way that wealth has been accumulated since day one, which is why Jesus endlessly speaks against it. Why Jesus said it's harder for a wealthy person to be a part of the kingdom of God, so hard, in fact, that he calls it impossible. He has this crazy illustration about camels and needles and, the eye of a needle. Like this crazy illustration about how it's basically impossible, right? The wealth of nations is essentially a fancy way of saying the things that hurt people. It's the way it is. Throughout history, the pursuit of more land, more people, more gold, more everything. That's how empires are built. And you know what empires do? They slaughter people. And I don't care if it's the Assyrian Empire. I don't care if it's the Greek Empire. I don't care if it's the Roman Empire. I don't care. They all do the same stuff. And so, there is a degree to which God looks at people, and we're all sort of the same. Yeah. The wickedness of the people of Israel looks a whole lot to God like the wickedness of the people of Babylon, which looks a whole lot to God like the wickedness of the Assyrians. It's just people with power exploiting people without, people with wealth exploiting people without. That's all it is. And so God says to Habakkuk, I have told you, all of it will turn to ash. Meaning, the things we fight wars over are temporary. The things we exploit each other over are temporary. The things we hurt each other over are temporary. This whole system of greed and grabbing and wanting more, it's temporary. All of it will be turned to ash. We work so hard. The hilarious thing is all the powerful people, it's sort of funny, the powerful people who spend their whole lives hurting others to accumulate stuff die and have none of the stuff they accumulated. They got nothing. It's just over. He says it's all in vain. God says our pursuits of hurting others to get ahead is all in vain. Which is a fancy way of saying this. The things that hurt us in our world are temporary. We don't hurt forever. We don't suffer forever. It goes away. That's what's going on here. He's telling Habakkuk, look, I'm not saying any, like you can argue with what I'm doing. You can argue with why I'm doing it. Fine, have at it. Just understand what you're asking for to go away will. Because all of the things that hurt everyone are temporary. But what's not temporary is that second thing. I love the illustration. It says, as the waters fill the sea. And I love that because do we have sea without waters? Like if there's no waters, it's not a sea, it's just a hole, right? Like what makes it a sea is that there's waters in it. So like it's all like, it's perfectly linked. If you have to have it. So as the waters fill the sea, the earth is being filled with the awareness of God's glory. What God is promising to Habakkuk is it's not just that the things that hurt us are temporary, it's that they're being replaced by something wonderful. The glory of God. And the more we recognize the glory of God, the more we recognize the character of God, the more we understand who God is at his very core, the more that the things of the wealth of the nations, all these things that hurt people, all the things that are temporary simply don't matter to us. This is good news. Habakkuk is being promised the pain is temporary, but God's glory isn't. It may not be okay now, but it will be. And it's fascinating, Habakkuk's response. It's fascinating. Because if I'm being honest, I'm not sure I'd have gotten there. This is why he's a prophet and I'm not. But this is his response. It's in Habakkuk chapter 30. It's the last part of the book. This is his conclusion at the end of his conversation with God. He says, even though the fig trees have no blossoms, and there are no grapes on the vines, even though the olive crop fails and the fields lie empty and barren, even though the flocks die in the fields and the cattle barns are empty, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in the God of my salvation. The sovereign Lord is my strength. He makes me as sure-footed as a deer, able to tread upon the heights. Habakkuk essentially says, even if I have absolutely nothing else, including food, God is still strengthening me, and he is still worthy of my respect, my honor, my prayers, my love, and my worship. Even if I have literally nothing else. And by the way, he's not far off. What's about to happen, we know in history. We know because, we live now, and Habakkuk didn't. The Babylonians will crush them in a way no one else ever has. We call it the Babylonian exile. It's going to literally crush the nation, destroy the temple of Israel. The temple will be left in a heap, so they cannot worship, so there's no point in being home, and they will take them. And they will scatter them throughout the empire, and they will take the best and brightest of the people of Israel, and they will take them and turn them into Babylonians, or at least try. That's the story of Daniel. It is brutal what happens to the people of Israel. And Habakkuk says, even if I have nothing, no temple, no land, no food, nothing, God is worthy of worship. Here's why he says that. There's this distinction that Habakkuk ends up making. And it's a distinction that we, in our lives, need to make as well. Habakkuk's complaints to God were based on how he perceived God working in the world. In other words, his complaint was simply, God, I think you should do this. God, I don't think you should do this. God, I think you should have that. I think you shouldn't have that. His complaints are purely the work of God. And when he finds peace, he's not thinking about the work of God anymore. He's thinking about the character of God. It is God's glory that brings him peace, not God's work in the world. And you think, well, what's the difference? You know what? Don't those go together? Well, a little bit. And you think, well, how do we separate that? Well, this is really important. And here's why it's so important for our trust in God to be based on who God is, not what God does. So I would like to think that God wants me in some way or shape or form to be a preacher. And I think that at some point in the past that God, I'd like to think at least, that God sort of orchestrated it so I would be the preacher of Ashland Christian Church. I would like to think that, okay? Maybe I'm just got an ego problem. Like maybe I'm just being silly, but I'd like to think that by me being the preacher of Ashland Christian Church, that I am honoring God's call on my life. What I'm saying when I say that is that God must have done some things, God must have worked to get me here. Right? Right. So what were they? Well, the easiest way to do is one day, like 15, 18 years ago, something like that, I went to this Christian service fair at my college, and I met some folks. One of them was John. He's back there. Hi, John. Yeah. And one of them was John, and they had this table, and they're like, hey, we're with Ashland Christian Church, and we need some people to do some Christian service. And I met them, and they were like the nicest people I'd ever met. Like, they don't make people nice like that in Indiana. And I was like, man, that is really cool. Those people are great. I want to go work with them. And so I did. Easy enough to say. Well, then God orchestrated our meeting. Okay. That also means that God orchestrated the fact that I needed to go to the Christian service fair because I went to a college where you had to do Christian service. Like you had to volunteer, Christian service, a couple hours a week. That was a thing you had to do. Which means God had to orchestrate somebody coming up with a rule about Christian service at the college I went to. I can buy that. Okay. All right. But then that also means that God had to orchestrate getting me to college that has the Christian service thing, that has the fair where I meet the people, including John, right? So that's what I have to do. So I guess I can see that, except also I lived those moments. So I know why I went to college, and if I got to tell you the truth, sometimes when I tell this story, I get a little spiritual about it. I'm like, well, he just led me here. Or sometimes I give credit to the college, they were just so nice. And if you guys notice, I'll follow nice people anywhere. I just like nice people. Oh, they're so nice. And those things are true. Those things are true. But a big motivating factor in why I came to Missouri was because 6 hours is shorter than 9 hours. And the two colleges I was deciding between were a college in Missouri that was 6 hours away from home and a college in Tennessee that was 9 hours away. And I had this girlfriend, you see. And I wanted to get home as often as I could to see this girlfriend. And, saving that 3 hours one way, man, that was swell. So now we're saying that God orchestrated this girlfriend to get me to go to the college 6 hours away instead of 9 hours away, to get me to the place with the college that has the Christian service fair, which gets me to the Christian service fair in itself, which meets me with John and the nice people. So maybe God wanted me to date that girl. She was nice. I got nothing bad to say about her. She was cool. She didn't like me very much, and she broke up with me at the end, but, I live with me. I get it, I understand. What are you going to do? I thought she was great, though, So maybe God wanted me to date her. We're doing that. Okay. But see, the only reason I was dating that girl is because I dated a lot of other girls who were nothing like her. And so, man, those relationships were less good and less healthy for 4 years of high school. Basically did nothing but date terribly unhealthy, toxic situations. I'm not saying it was the ladies. That's what I'm saying. It could have been me, could have been me. But, what are you going to do? All the way back to you guys, you wonder, why did you date so much? I'll tell you why I dated so much. I was 14 years old, and there was this girl. I'm not going to say her name. It rhymes with Schmegan. And there was this girl named Megan. I didn't want to say her name. Oh. There's this girl, and I didn't want to date. I was 14. I just want to play video games and hang out with my friends. But this girl would not take no for an answer. She was aggressive, guys. I'm pretty sure I was bullied into dating when I was 14. So now we're saying that God called me to ministry at Ashland Christian Church because I met some people at Bible college, this Bible college that has this rule for the Christian service hours, which is the college I went to because it was shorter time to go from Indiana to here because I had this girlfriend that I liked very much who was a result of lots of other girlfriends I didn't like, at the beginning of which there was a girl who bullied me into dating. So did God want this girl to bully me into dating? It starts to get crazy and absurd. How far back do we want to go? It starts to get just lunacy to think through, what is God doing? I don't know what God is doing. I have no idea how God works. I don't know. I don't have a clue. I just know I'm here and I'm supposed to be faithful. So that's what I'm trying to do. And that's all it is, right? That's probably the way it should be for all of us. I think. But you see, that's the way things work. And we talk about it over and over and over, and we talk about the way that, God works. At the end of the day, if we're just being honest with ourselves, we so often want to say, well, God must have done A, B, and C because, look at X, Y, and Z. And we always ignore the other letters. And then it's like, well, are we going to give credit to God for the good stuff, but not give God blame for the bad stuff? I've noticed a lot of Christians don't want to give God blame for bad stuff. I've noticed a lot of people who aren't Christians only give God blame for bad stuff and no credit for good stuff. We're fun like that, we humans. And maybe the answer is what Habakkuk did. And simply say, you know what? I don't know. I don't know what God's always up to. I can try to think about it, I can try to work it out. I've got some suspicions about stuff, honestly. But I don't know what God is doing. It's that whole, that terrible cliche phrase, well, God works in mysterious ways. That's a conversation ender. Let's stop using it. Let's have the conversation, but let's also recognize that God does work in mysterious ways. I told you not to use it, and I just did. God does work in ways that we don't get. God did tell Habakkuk, I'm raising up the Babylonians. That's a crazy pants idea. That doesn't make any sense the way we understand anything. And God says, well, I told you wouldn't like it. I told you wouldn't understand it. Told you wouldn't believe it. You wanted to hear it anyway. We're not prophets. God doesn't tell us what he's up to. But it seems really futile to be sitting around saying, well, I bet God's doing that, and I bet God's doing that, and I bet God's not doing that. And for that to be the basis of our trust and our faith is extremely shaky ground. The firm foundation of the faith of, all those F's, alliteration. I should be a 3-point preacher. The firm foundation of the faith of Habakkuk was the character of God. It was the glory of God. It was who God is, not what God does. And that leads us to Jesus. You see, because while I don't know exactly what God is doing, I don't, or will do, or has done even, what I can be sure of is who God is. This is where we read the Apostle Paul telling the ancient church of Colossae about exactly who God is. It goes like this. Christ is the visible image of the invisible God. He existed before anything was created. He is supreme over all creation. For through him, God created everything in the heavenly realms and on earth. He made the things we can see and the things we can't see, thrones, kingdoms, rulers, and authorities in the unseen world. Everything was created through him and for him. He existed before anything else. And he holds all creation together. Christ is also the head of the church, which is his body. He is the beginning, supreme over all who are raised from the dead. So he is first in everything. For God in all his fullness was pleased to live in Christ. And through him, God reconciled everything to himself. He made peace with everything in heaven and on earth by means of Christ's blood on the cross. Here's why I love this passage. I could talk for the next 3 hours about why I love this passage. That's my favorite verse in the Bible. Passage of the Bible. Favorite chunk of the Bible. Passage chunk. My favorite. You see, there's some really amazing promises, okay, in that passage. God made peace with everything in heaven and earth. He reconciled everybody through the blood of Christ. Those are some amazing promises, right? That's what a beautiful thing. God, Christ made everything. There's just all sorts of wonderful, beautiful promises, and yet they all take a back seat to who Jesus is. He is the image. He is the visible image of the invisible God. He is supreme over everything in creation, be it things we can see or things we can't see. By the way, does it weird anybody else out that there's things we don't see that are called thrones, kingdoms, rulers, and authorities? That's crazy and fun, and I have no idea what it means. None. But it's neat. You see, at the end of the day, our faith is not in the promises of God. Our faith is in God. Our faith is not what we think Christ is doing. Our faith is in Christ. And if we want to know who God is, we simply look at Jesus. The answer to all our questions of who is God are found in Jesus. There are no questions to be asked about who God is that are not found in who Jesus is. And so as Christians, our faith, our foundation, who we are as people is not based on some speculation or some understanding of what God is doing or what God might do or whatever. Guys, that's like every theological argument I've ever known has been, well, I think God does this, or I think God did this, or I think God is doing this. And look, it's all speculation. Nobody knows. But what we can know is the very character of God is expressed in Jesus. And if we want to know who God is, we look at Jesus. And that is a lifelong pursuit. I'm not pretending like that's an easy thing. I'm not pretending that like, oh, well, it's just Jesus and that's just, no, that is an invitation to study and wrestle and question and doubt and all the other things too. But it's a wonderful, that's the foundation. The foundation is in who Jesus is, not what Jesus does. And what Jesus does is wonderful. But the faith, the hope, is in Jesus. Because at the end of the day, the right sort of faith is to say, look, even if I have nothing, even if God doesn't do anything for me, even if I have nothing to eat, even if my nation falls, even if I get that the wealth of the world is going to be turned to ash, but that ain't now. Powerful people oppressing people that aren't. Even if we end up on the wrong side of that. If we're saying, God, what are you doing? We're going to lose our faith. But if we say, God, we know who you are, and we know you are good, and we know you are love, and we know that you're with us, and we know you're here, and we know you're Christ, that's our faith. I mean, I think Jesus said something about building a house on the rock instead of the sand. That's the rock we build a house on. Jesus, the way, the truth, and the life, who he is. And 2020 has been tough. And like I said a couple weeks ago, I don't know if 2021 is going to be any better, but I'm willing to roll those dice. Let's see. As we end this year, as we look to next year, let's take an opportunity to make sure that we're on the right foundation. A lot of things have happened this year, and a lot of different venues and areas that have made people wonder, what is God doing? And the answer, if we're all being honest, is, yeah, I don't know. But our trust is not in what God's doing. Our trust in is who God is and who Christ is. And that's a beautiful thing. And that is my favorite Old Testament story. And that is my favorite New Testament passage. And I just preached a sermon about the two of them together. And I don't think anybody else has ever done that. I just want that to be known. I don't think anybody else has ever said, I'm going to do Habakkuk and Colossians 1. Let's do that. And I'm really happy with myself for that, if I could be so bold. Our final lesson from 2020. As we go into 2021 next year, which is actually next year, we'll start a brand new series of series, and we'll start over. But our final lesson this year is this. We trust in God's glory, who he is, no matter what we think he should do, shown to us clearly in Jesus. That sentence is a little weird. Probably could have done that one a little better. I'm going to read it again and see if it sounds a little better. We trust in God's glory, who he is, no matter what we think he should do, shown to us clearly in Jesus. It's not better the second time. You guys get it. You guys get it. You guys listened to the last 40 minutes of this, so you get it. Cool. We offer an invitation. That's what we offer each and every week. Singers are going to sing. Musicians are going to come up here. We're going to offer an invitation. The Bible teaches that when we understand who this is, that when we place our trust in Jesus, and we place our trust in Jesus, in God and in his character, that we're to repent to be baptized. That sounds like two things. It's just one. As in repentance, we change our minds, our hearts, who we are. And in baptism, it is a picture of that change. It is a picture of who we are as people being joined to who Christ is as a person in his death, his resurrection, and his rebirth, his resurrection. Death, burial, and resurrection is what I was looking for. Anyway, I'm losing track of my train of thought, and it's happening quickly. So let's just say this. You guys know how this goes. There's an invitation. The perfect church line should be here. Insert it in your own head, and let's sing some songs. Cool? All right, let's stand.